It's Monday, November 14th, and with great sadness, I have to report that we lost these 6 gentlemen in the tragic midair of the P-63 King Cobra colliding with the B-17 Flying Fortress over the Wings Over Dallas Air Show commemorative Air Force display back on Saturday, 12 November. Craig Hutain was the pilot of the P-63 King Cobra. Terry Barker and Len Root were the pilots of the B-17. Terry and Len recently retired from American Airlines. Len was my check airman on the Airbus A320 aircraft when I got checked out several years ago for my IOE initial operating experience doing the Los Angeles-Honolulu run. This accident occurred at 13:21 local time in the middle of the bomber parade portion of the flying demonstrations during this air show. This accident occurred at the Dallas Executive Airport just south of Dallas. The collision occurred just as the aircraft were crossing the Highway 67 and proceeding northwestbound just to the left of the approach end of runway 31. The wreckage ended up right in this area here. To get a better understanding of how the bomber parade flight path looks, we'll have to untangle this data from ADSB Exchange. The bomber parade is meant to be a series of passes by the bombers in trail formation from left to right and right to left in front of the crowd. On this clip from 2021, last year, we'll see that the fighter aircraft are in formations of 3 above the bombers during this portion of the show. Air shows like this are highly choreographed events with a lot of briefings and pre-planning put in long before the show begins. There's somebody called the air boss. That's the person in charge of the aircraft during the air show, and he generally has communications, direct communications with the pilots during the show. This year's bomber parade appears to be a double teardrop affair where the aircraft fly parallel to the runway, turn away from the crowd and the runway, and then do a right-hand turn in this case, and do a pass from right to left, and then another right-hand turn to a left-hand turn for a pass from left to right. This keeps the aircraft flying past the crowd almost continuously. The crowd is located back here behind the runway, and a deadline is established, and it's generally located right about along the runway center line so the pilots can easily identify it, and at no time is any pilot ever allowed to fly over that deadline and get too close to the crowd. This year's bomber pattern appears to have the bombers set up at about 500 feet above the ground. The fighter aircraft, or the smaller aircraft, generally chase the bombers around the pattern, but appear to fly a slightly tighter pattern inside that of the bombers. What I'm not clear about at this time is, was there a separation of altitude between the bombers and the fighter aircraft? Or were they both allowed to operate at the same altitude? And during these turnarounds for the fighter aircraft shown in green here, they often pop up in altitude and they're able to tighten up their turn radius and get turned around and then descend in altitude back to their pass before the crowd at about 500 feet above the ground. What's very clear from all the video evidence is that the pilot of the P-63 lost sight of the B-17. From this angle, the P-63 cannot see the B-17, and here's why. Like most aircraft in World War II, the P-63 has a very long nose. Generally, these long noses are where the engine is housed. But in the P-63, in its unique design, the engine is mounted over the wing. It's a center-mounted engine. The whole idea with the P-63 is they built the airplane around the gun. A 70-millimeter cannon resides here in the nose, along with the nose gear. Tricycle gear design aircraft has the nose gear up here as well. With the whole idea of mounting the cannon in the nose of the P-63, you can mount the cannon so that you can fire it directly through the center of the propeller. You run the drive shaft down low to the propeller reduction drive, and then can run the cannon through the middle of that drive unit and the propeller. And in so doing, you eliminate the need to harmonize your guns as they fire around the arc of the propeller, and thus increase the lethal range of your weapons. You don't need to harmonize your guns and have a narrow lethal range of just 1,000 feet or so, because you're firing straight through the propeller. So in the P-63, with the engine mounted here in the middle, the pilot sits just in front of the engine with the drive shaft of the engine running between his legs through the floorboards, and then the cannon mounted right in front of him. Now, in this walk-around video of the accident aircraft by Eric Johnston, done some years ago, with CAF pilot Mark Allen, Mark points out some of the limitations of the visibility on the P-63. First, with the cockpit being mounted forward of the engine, Eric points out that you are located just on the leading edge of the wings, so you can see down to the ground ahead of the wings. But as Mark points out in this video, the P-63 has even more reduced visibility than that of the P-51 Mustang. The P-51D model Mustang has a nice bubble canopy around it. The P-63 has this door frame style cockpit with a lot of framing members that tend to block your view in this position here, as well as this tall cockpit panel located right here, which tends to block your visibility below and ahead of you, plus the long nose of the aircraft. In order to demonstrate this, we've taken one of Pete's P-51 Airfix models apart here, and we've got a not-to-scale model of a Boeing 757. Now remember, the P-51 nose has better visibility than the P-63. Also, too, we're not replicating the frames of the P-63 cockpit. More on that in a minute. But if we're down here with the model of the 757, you can't see it. And as we move in closer and closer and closer with the 757, it does not become visible until it's much too late, much too close. And here's an example with an even larger scale model of the Boeing 777. Again, if it's down here, it's out of sight, and you're not going to see it until it is much too close. And from this view, just moments before the collision, you can see the B-17 is slightly below the nose of the P-63, and also the B-17 is right in alignment with the right door and window frame of the P-63. Now the question is, why did the P-63 pilot lose this situational awareness in the first place? Another factor in all this may be the color of the B-17, the Texas Raider, which was painted camouflage color, or a dark green, and that was some fairly dark green terrain they were flying over at the time of impact off to the side of the runway. And when you take this camouflage and put it in against dark green, it's harder to see. Regardless, none of the fighter aircraft should have ever lost sight of any of the bombers during this formation flyby. They need to maintain situational awareness of where all the aircraft are at all times. And that's a lot of aircraft in the pattern to keep track of. Especially if you're going to start running co-altitude or at the same altitude. If you're going to start running the aircraft with no altitude separation. Here's the ADSB data for the B-17. They depart runway 31, do a right-hand turn, and then hold over here to the northeast of the runway until the air boss calls them in. And then they come in over midfield and then enter the bomber parade pattern, doing multiple passes from left to right and right to left. They've got a speed of... well, yeah, you can see there is a bit of wind here today. We've got, it looks like a wind out of the north. We've got a ground speed of 178 knots as they're proceeding southeast, and that ground speed slows to 140 knots, 150 knots as they proceed from south to northwest, southeast to northwest. So a good wind coming down out of the north and or northwest. And this is the circuit of the last pass right here, showing a ground speed of about 140 to 150 knots. Correction, here it is right here, 140 to 150 knots, with the collision occurring right here just over the freeway, or just beyond the freeway. Here's the ADSB data from the lead aircraft, or one of the two Mustangs ahead of the P-63, the two Mustangs that the P-63 was following. It looks like they had just begun their parade flight pattern as they took off, held, and then were called in midfield by the air boss. In this case, it looks like they came in with a left base entry into the parade, and then did a climbing tight turn here on the south end of the parade route, picking up to about 189, 200 knots, so a good 50 knot difference between the fighter aircraft and the bomber aircraft, and then descending down to an altitude, about the same altitude and about the same location as the bomber. So I don't see a lot of lateral separation between the B-17 and the fighter aircraft, and virtually no altitude separation. And here's the ADSB data from the P-63, November 6763, where the data ends here right over the freeway. They're showing 219 knots and 600 feet. And we can see the P-63 on his final run. He makes a run due north, paralleling the road, and not getting aligned with the runway here at the last moment, at about the time of the collision. Now what the P-63 pilot is trying to do is follow the two P-51 Mustangs, and he's also aware of the deadline here at the runway. He cannot cross over that deadline. If he crosses over that deadline, he's going to lose his privileges to be able to fly these aircraft probably ever again. Now, with permission from Richard of Oz, we're going to use his video where he's overlaid this ADSB data to see how these aircraft come together. Remember, Craig in the P-63 is following not one but two P-51s in front of him. So there are three P-51s that are going to go fly past the B-17. They've been authorized by the air boss to go ahead and overtake the B-17. But they're still in this left-hand turn doing so. So we have the B-17 down here. In this case, we're showing 28 Victor, the green and silver P-51, and then the silver P-63 back here in the last place position. Ahead of these two aircraft is a third P-51, the lead P-51. And you can see that in some of the videos, especially the videos that were shot over by the McDonald's located back over here. So 28 Victor is now passing the B-17 safely off to the left and is going to get lined up with the airfield. And here comes the P-63 chasing. He's keeping in sight 28 Victor, this aircraft here. But he has lost situational awareness with the B-17 and continues to fly straight towards the B-17 in his blind spot until he hits him right here at the same altitude. Another things investigators are going to be looking at is, was there the beginning of a loss of separation between the P-63 and the P-51 in front of him? The Mustangs were told to overtake the B-17. The P-63 gets moving pretty fast. He starts closing in on the P-51 in front of him. At that low altitude, he's got the only way he can increase his separation right about here is to go wide. Again, if he has lost complete situational awareness, not realizing that the B-17 is right there, if he goes wide in an effort to increase his spacing on the aircraft in front of him, he's going to fly right into the B-17. Now let's talk about some formation flying basics and some hard lessons we've learned from air racing for years up at the Reno National Championship air races. It's safe to pass an aircraft when you're straight and level like this. It is never safe to pass an airplane like this from here to here. For example, at the Reno National Championship air races, you can only pass an aircraft if you pass above and to the outside of that aircraft. You can never, ever, ever pass an aircraft inside of them like this. Why? Because of formation basics. You can never go belly up to another airplane because you will lose sight of that airplane and you will hit him. In a basic formation rejoin that we practice over and over again in the Air Force, we'll practice turning rejoins where we want to get into formation and get into position and stay there in the left-hand turn. We like to use the left-hand turn to rejoin because we can use angular cutoff to help quickly get into position. But what we have to continuously practice is overshooting that formation rejoin. What do you do when you screw it up? You've got to keep this aircraft in sight. You're coming in at too fast of a rate of closure. The natural human reaction, just like stalling an aircraft into the ground or heading for the ground, your natural human reaction is to pull away from that aircraft. But it's not going to happen. You've got too much inertia and you're going to smash right into that aircraft. So instead, on a formation rejoin overshoot, you must lower your wing and slide underneath the aircraft ahead of you and then roll into your bank angle, get rid of that excess energy out here, get it under control before rejoining the formation. Now, if you are down to 500 feet in elevation, 500 feet above the ground that is, you have effectively cut off your only safe place to escape an overshooting rejoining position, which makes me question the whole idea of parading around like this at the same altitude and having that altitude only at 500 feet. That is, having no altitude separation between the bombers and the fighters when you have differences of speed upwards of 50 knots. You cannot safely pass another aircraft in formation unless you keep that aircraft in sight at all times. If you lose sight of the aircraft you're flying formation with, you need to declare knock it off, lost sight, and leave the formation. Len was instrumental in helping me understand what happened to the Collings Foundation B-17 crash back in 2019. If he were here today, he could certainly help us understand how this bomber parade route is supposed to go. Thanks so much for your support of this channel. See you here.